Happy Thursday! We're back with another episode of Go FUD Yourself. Kiara has transitioned, and her new name is. So Kiara / Patrick, welcome to the pod. How you doing, buddy?
Hey, I can guarantee you that it's me, Patrick. Kiara has not transitioned.
She is in Australia right now, though, which is kind of cool. Apparently it took her 45 hours or some nonsense to get there, which is kind of crazy, but she made it. So today, in her absence, we're still, to honor Kiara, we're still going to do crypto arms race. So we're going to start in Brazil, talk a little bit about OKX and some of the major banks in Brazil and some of their, I suppose, federal programs to get taxes for crypto wealth and deal with that kind of stuff. We'll talk about that later. Kenya, we're going to talk about Kenya and some of their regulatory moves. What Trezor is doing in Africa to help support Bitcoin education, Bitcoin adoption. We're going to talk about South Africa's crypto license scenario a little bit. We'll talk about the UK. And finally, we'll end with an Italy and South Korea alliance. We're a live show, Monday to Friday, 12:30 p.m. Eastern. Like, share, subscribe, help us get the word out. Quick shout out to our merch sponsor today, one of my other companies, Benki. If I had to guess, there's a pretty good chance that we're deploying a new project today. You heard it here first. Or a new product today. So we'll see. We'll see if everything goes as swimmingly as we expect. But keep your eyes out. Again, shout out to Benki. Patrick, quick, high level, Arrow Markets, what is it? How do they find you?
Yeah, Arrow Markets is an options trading platform on Avalanche. Go to arrow.markets to check it out. Also, check us out on Twitter at Arrow Markets. Amazing.
And we'll put those links under the video, of course, so you can follow up with Patrick anytime. Yeah, he does answer his DMs too, so spam him. And yeah, let's freaking go. All right, welcome back to the show. Patrick, we're going to start in Brazil, where I have never been, but I heard ETH Rio is in like February or something. So maybe we'll have to check it out because Brazil apparently is pretty fun. But all of that to say, OKX is now jumping in, trying to contribute to the crypto frenzy in Brazil. And we've talked about this a lot. Over the last few months and so on. But a lot of Brazilians are aware of and participate in crypto. One of the largest Latin America countries, according to, I think it was Nansen. Was it Nansen or Massari? Neither. It's Chainalysis. According to Chainalysis, crypto adoption is the highest in Latin American countries in Brazil for 2023. So it's 9th globally in crypto adoption. So there's a lot of people in Brazil that are interested. Now, there's a few reasons for that. One, of course, similar to many other developing nations, remittances are a big challenge for them. There's a lot of people that move abroad, send money home, MoneyGram and whatever those other extortion level money transfer remittance platforms. The fees are insane. So there's a lot of people using it for that reason. Obviously, inflation and some like kind of crazy flip-floppy governments and so on is a bit of a problem. So OKX has said they're building a local exchange and a wallet platform specifically for Brazil, which I think is really interesting. It's kind of a concentration of efforts on a fairly large country, the 9th largest in the world, that I don't think too many other major exchanges are focused on right now, which is really exciting. I think the Brazilian government has kind of flip-flopped a little bit. They hated crypto, loved crypto. Now accept crypto as far as I know. But anyways, Patrick, do you think that this is the type of catalyst that these countries are looking for? Centralized exchanges from, Asia or other markets coming. Do you think it's going to move the needle?
I think it's incremental, but I think it's in the direction of more adoption. Obviously, it's in the right direction. There's another story that we mentioned that we're going to talk about in a little more detail today about how the Brazilian government is levying an additional tax on exchanges who are operating outside of the country. So part of this might just be OKX saying, look, we have a substantial user base in Brazil. We're going to be subject to this additional tax burden if we don't also set up Brazilian operations in particular. So part of it may just be a reaction to the Brazilian, federal tax policy. But the tax policy is smart because, if economists often think about taxes as kind of levers that governments have, tools that they have at their disposal to incentivize certain types of behavior. And so I think that it's a incremental step in the direction of more crypto adoption. So that's great. I also think it might be kind of a logical response to some of these programs that the Brazilian government is putting in place to incentivize the companies to operate domestically.
Certain actions, yeah. One other interesting point, we can kind of move on. We'll talk a little bit about one of the largest banks in Brazil. But what was interesting is about 80% of all transactions involving cryptocurrency in Brazil involve Tether, the stablecoin Tether, which is interesting. Again, that kind of lends itself quite comfortably to my remittance comment earlier. But often it's a transfer of value to others. And whether that's point of sale or peer-to-peer or what the deal is, that's compelling. Obviously, that's a lot of transactions that are facilitated using Tether, which is interesting. I'm not sure why Tether. A few years ago, it was Binance and Kraken that were all over Brazil, and I think Binance got in a tuffle with the government or something, and Binance, I'm pretty sure, pulled out. They lost their banking partners and a few other things, and there was no on-ramps and off-ramps in Brazil. So I'm not 100% certain, you can't quote me on it, but I think Binance pulled out. I don't know. I haven't heard about Kraken. But yeah, I think your observation is probably pretty correct. We'll have to see how this kind of evolves. Let's move on. We'll talk a little bit about Itaú Unibanco, which is the largest bank in Brazil. They've launched a trading service for their clients. They're a crypto custodian, so they want to expand to more and more assets. This is kind of interesting. We're seeing this happen in kind of two different ways globally. One, in some jurisdictions, the existing banking infrastructure is being heavily relied on to participate in crypto. So this is an example of that. The largest bank in Brazil, they get all the green lights for custody and all of this stuff and licenses, and they can start allowing their users to transact in crypto. So it'll be interesting. That's one way of approaching it. So it'll be interesting, I think, to see if that's the path that's going to succeed, or if we're going to see more innovative kind of smaller indie type projects eventually scale, and we'll see a new class of large cap financial institutions, in the coming decades. I'm not sure. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think this is good or bad for the industry, where the largest bank in the country is able to now issue and transact assets?
I think it's good just because it leads to more user adoption. Some of the risks of having incumbents kind of take the lead in building some of the new infrastructure and kind of controlling how the mass adoption plays out is that the incumbents may not pick up on some of the real kind of Web3 native efficiency improvements that
or they may not want
in the space. They may not want to even, right?
Yeah.
They may actually have an incentive. Yeah, so I think there is some tension there. So on the one hand, I think this type of thing is good because it increases awareness and user adoption. On the other hand, to your point, it's a risk. It's always a risk when incumbents have too much control over how the new technology is incorporated.
Yeah, in finance in particular, there's so much regulatory capture. There's so much expense layered on because of regulation, because of all the intermediaries. In my opinion, there's also a lot of rent-seeking behavior. There's a lot of companies that exist only to fill a middle gap somewhere, and they don't actually add a bunch of value. They just add another cost center. Anyways, the reason I'm bringing all of this up is from the incumbent perspective, that's one of the biggest challenges. Blockchain and crypto already threatens their current revenue models. Arguably, for the better long term. Yes, less revenue on certain products, but much more revenue on a broader swath of products over time in a more efficient way with lower overhead. In theory, the economics will work out over time. But in the short term, in order to properly adopt blockchain technology, they have to sacrifice many of their rent-seeking opportunities. And it's just a conflict of motivation, right? Like, yes, they want to participate. They know they have to because they're going to lose the land grab. But when they do they want to cannibalize their own profits? I think that's the dilemma that a lot of these institutions, and to your point, then they might not know, or they might consciously decline to pay attention to, particular realities or particular opportunities because it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there is some real tension there. I mean, and this is something you and I have obviously thought about over the years and over the past couple of years. And I think how that kind of trade-off is calibrated is going to play a major role in kind of shaping what crypto looks like to the typical user, say 5 years from now.
Yeah.
I'll just say one other quick point on this. I mean, I think you guys are thinking about this the right way on your podcast, framing it as a crypto arms race kind of competition between different jurisdictions globally. And so I think it's the right type of thing for it's the right type of analysis to be doing, to be comparing these different experiments that are being carried out differently across different countries, right? And you see which ones are more successful, and kind of as a global community, we can kind of take the pieces that work best when we watch these experiments play out.
Well, that's what's so exciting about the open source nature of and on-chain transparency of blockchain is that we can in real time observe these experiments, and we can in real time observe the data, not just what the jurisdictions tell us that we should know. We can in fact verify, and I think that's really compelling long term. Of course, let's move quickly to Brazil and kind of their coming taxation. This is a headline that I don't really love. Brazil takes aim at crypto wealth. I think that's a little fuddy. I don't think they're taking aim at crypto wealth. All they're doing is they're trying to clarify taxation rules. Now, do I love that there's an additional 15% potential crypto tax on income from exchanges outside of the country? No, I believe that's a little forcibly protectionist. I don't think that's the best way to do it, but I do think that it's super common for every other jurisdiction globally to care about your tax activities outside of the country. You have to report all of that stuff, and there's taxes on foreign income, of course. So this to me isn't that surprising. This actually 15% crypto income tax, that's pretty good. I would take that all day long. Outside, for anything held outside of the country. I mean, we haven't talked a ton about taxation, Patrick, but what are your thoughts on the way that taxation is kind of evolving globally too? Do you think we're on the right track, most jurisdictions, or?
I think it's another one of these dimensions where watching the kind of differential experiments play out is going to be important. I think in a lot of jurisdictions, tax policy, fiscal policy is kind of clouded by all types of other legacy and political friction. So it's hard to kind of analyze in clear isolation. I do think this type of targeted taxation, we mentioned this in the earlier topic as well, it is a relevant and valuable tool for governments who want to incentivize certain types of behavior, particularly business behavior. And so it's not necessarily true that increasing taxes is bad in every situation. Governments can choose tax policies that smartly incentivize behavior that actually leads to more productivity and then ultimately potentially more tax revenue for the government. So it's like I said, it's another one of these dimensions where I think it's gonna be really interesting to watch the differential experiments play out. And tax policies around the globe are kind of clouded by a bunch of different factors, but to the extent we can get these very narrow targeted policies with respect to crypto businesses and so forth, it's not necessarily bad. It can be good if they're smart.
Yeah. I mean, taxes are just one of those things that are certain. And I mean, for all of human history where taxes have been a thing, so all of modern human history, there's been taxes of some sort. And I mean, you could put 100 people in the room in any country on earth, and you'll have 50 people that are 100% convicted that more taxation is better for the government, better for revenue, better for society. The other 50 people, with the same conviction and unwavering commitment, will say that less taxation leads to greater GDP growth. I'm in the latter camp because there's more evidence of that. But again, the point remains, no matter what you do with taxation, 50% of the population is going to be annoyed. The other 50% is going to think it's great. It's great. So it will be interesting. It'll be interesting to see objective data after the fact, because the other thing you see all the time is the countries then try to justify what they did, just to save face, so to speak, for their people. But in this particular case, it's another example of it'll be obvious whether their policies made sense or not, because you'll see in real time adoption in different jurisdictions relative to others. And so that's going to be.
That's a great point. I mean, the crypto arms race analysis is a little bit clouded also by the fact that, to your point, governments are typically not going to admit when their experiments have failed.
No.
So you're going to have to just analyze it objectively and decide for yourself which experiments succeed or fail, because the governments aren't going to say, hey, this failed, we're going to change and do this thing the other government.
So on that note, I'm actually we were supposed to go to Kenya next, but I'm going to go just to the UK quickly.
Can I say one thing about Brazil before we jump?
Go ahead, yeah.
You mentioned Tether earlier. I found that was really interesting. There was more big news, I think, in the last week or so about Brazil, which was the partnership between Circle and Nubank. Did you guys talk about that?
I believe we talked about it last week.
So it's very interesting that USDC is making Circle is making these moves, and hence, USDC, given the prevalence of Tether. I wonder, how much the competitive forces motivated that. Yeah.
Well, they could be looking at it going, holy crap, Tether is 80% of all transactions in Brazil. Brazil is the 9th largest crypto adoption country in the world. That's some TAM that they can probably tap into pretty quickly. So I think it's great.
So
Sorry?
Real quick, I'll just say, I think, part of the reason some of this could be really powerful, and it's really interesting to see Circle partner with a bank like Nubank, is the fact that I've written about this before. Stablecoins are like banks. We could do a whole episode on this. So I don't want to kind of, maybe we should do a whole episode on this. I wrote a Substack about it. If people want to check it out, they can go to my Twitter, 0xprody, and see the link to my Substack. It's just Substack/Patrick C. Kiefer. But I wrote a Substack about how stablecoins are like depository institutions. So when I see these partnerships like, USDC partnering with Nubank in Brazil, I'm wondering how much of this is going to kind of translate into more and more use of something like a stablecoin technology in place of, retail banking, which would be something I'd be really excited to see.
Another group that we talk about a lot, and I'm a bit of a fanboy of, surprisingly, is XRP. And Ripple has done a lot of late in terms of partnering with major governments globally to build infrastructure to support stablecoin adoption, and also CBDCs for countries that are looking at CBDCs, which we all know I'm a pretty big opponent to, generally speaking. And so on that note, let's fly over to the UK quickly. Speaking of the government not liking to admit experiments may have failed. So there's a parliamentary, we talked about this a while ago. We've actually talked about this a few times. So the UK has had kind of a CBDC focus group, so to speak, or consultation group that's been headed up by some committee, Bank of England and Treasury Committee. And so anyways, they were looking at and soliciting feedback and trying to design and structure how they would build a CBDC digital pound in the UK. And so there was a lot of speculation that they were pushing this quite heavily, no matter what, at all costs. And what's ended up happening is the parliamentary committee, in this case, has come back and said, hey, wait a second. We think the costs of doing this may significantly outweigh the risks. the real key here, and the reason I think this is interesting, it'll be interesting to see if the UK government as a whole, not just this committee, then decides that this is relevant information and to act accordingly, or if they push it through anyways and don't want to admit that, yes, we entered into this consultation phase, but didn't like the results. It's very rare that you see governments explore something and then not do it, or once they do it, stop doing it. Almost always, it just becomes evergreen programs and all of this crap. Anyways, how do you feel about CBDCs, Patrick? I don't know if you and I have talked about this deeply, have we?
Yeah, we've talked about it a little. I mean, I think there are some clear advantages, but I think there's tension, right? And there are the costs in terms of the potential for government overreach are too great in my mind to make this calculus appealing in most cases. I think a lot of the efficiency gains that you could get from implementing a CBDC, you could also get from kind of a composition of private implementations. So, again, we could kind of do a whole episode on this, but that's the way I think about it. I think there are some potential efficiency gains from having something like a CBDC. I think the costs in terms of government overreach are too great. And so what we should be trying to do is to get at those efficiencies through private implementations.
That is by far more sophisticated than I would have said it. But it turns out we have the same philosophy. All right. We are going to fly back over to Kenya now. And so in the spirit of crypto regulation globally and countries, starting to compete to be a bit of a destination for both builders and users of this technology, Kenya has now finally passed a bill called the Capital Markets Bill of 2023, and it makes a significant step towards regulation and taxation of crypto assets. Now, one sec here. I just want to make sure I'm not misquoting this. So part of this suggests that there's going to be a 20% excise duty from banks. There's going to be capital gains on crypto transactions, which is great. It's not being considered income. It aims to regulate crypto trading to combat crime and terrorism financing. I mean, this is pretty standard. What I like about this, and this is what I've said for years, is that I don't think any jurisdiction is going to get this crazy comprehensive regulatory structure right on the first try. What I think we should do globally is what Kenya, in some cases Brazil, and many other smaller countries are doing, and that is they're starting with pretty broad regulations. Let's take a look at what are the biggest things we're concerned about? Terrorism financing, crime, money laundering, those big things, the big things that we're really concerned about, why we need fraud, negligence, all of that other stuff. Is there a way to address that without overcomplicating everything? And it sounds to me, and this is an example of that, where Kenya is saying, hey, we don't know all the answers to all this stuff. What we do know is that we need to be able to tax crypto. We need to tax it in such a way that it's attractive for people. And we need to create a pathway to compliance for exchanges and so on. But that's about it for now. They're not thinking about how to every little detail, as far as I can see, about how to issue assets and all of the licensing requirements and all this stuff. They're saying, hey, let's just start with this. Let's see how it goes, and then we can continue to narrow. And I think it's interesting, and I'd love your thoughts on this too. But I mean, you look at the Securities Act, right? We've had almost 100 years of the Securities Act in the U.S. I mean, the Securities Act established on day one versus the Securities Act today are two vastly different things. Over the course of the last 100 years, we've figured out a lot of adjustments that need to be made to those types of structures to be efficient. Now, we could all sit here and argue that it's still super inefficient the way that they've done it currently. Fine. What are your thoughts on that, Patrick? How do you think? What do you think the best way to roll this kind of stuff out is?
I mean, I think the way you described it is very smart. I mean, look, you're not going to have all the answers initially. You want to capture the main kind of moving pieces. You want to put some legislation in place that is able to tackle the primary concerns. So whatever, call them the 3 or 4 kind of principal order moving parts. And you want to set up you want to set it up in a way that it can be adaptive. So you start with something that covers these main concerns that you have, these kind of main moving parts, and you understand that it's going to be an iterative process. And as you learn more about the technology and how users interact with the technology and how the regulation impacts how users interact with the technology and so forth, then you can refine the legislations, tighten the screws, whatever, you can calibrate it over time. So I think that's a very smart way to do it. Start off, capture kind of the main moving pieces and proceed iteratively and kind of button it up over time. I think that's very smart.
It just feels like we're setting ourselves up for failure in any other way, right? I can't think of another environment where you expect perfection on the initial deployment. That goes against all entrepreneurial kind of philosophies at the moment of get your MVPs out, solicit user feedback, adjust, adapt, iterate.
Yeah, I mean, there's always trade-offs. Yeah, there's always trade-offs, and the risk is, to your point, because you also made a very good point about kind of the history of the securities regulations in the U.S. The risk is, by doing this iterative approach, that you kind of build in path dependencies, essentially these legacy components to the regulation, that you may not, if you were to, given everything you know today, if you were to recraft the legislation from scratch, there would be a bunch of pieces you wouldn't include because they just reflect some of these path dependencies. And so there's always this tension. The more you can say initially, the less you're going to be subject to these costs of kind of legacy frictions and path dependencies in the future. But the less you're willing to say initially, the faster you can move. And when you move fast, then over time, you're going to be responding to the things that you put in place. So it kind of, you're able to keep the initiative when you do it that way. And so there is a real tension between these things.
Yeah. We'll have to see, I guess, how it evolves. I mean, again, I mentioned this earlier in the call. One of my criticisms of government is I can't think of too many times where they've canceled something or reduced something or removed a regulation. There's a few examples, of course. But the problem, as evidenced by the Securities Act, is that it becomes this incredibly Frankenstein-esque type regulatory structure, right? Where you get all of these like amendments, and then there's jurisprudence that suggests certain things, and like all this other crap that that is coming in and influencing these regulatory structures. But what you never hear, to your point, is reduction in some of the regulatory structures because it's outdated, it's not relevant, it's maybe too opaque now for some of the details that we have. Anyways, I definitely am in the iterative camp on this one. I just think it makes more sense when you look across industries, across business sectors. That's how it goes. Okay, we're gonna end on a bit of a funny note. And so again, one of the things that I think the space is not prepared for, and Patrick, you and I were talking about this right before the call, or right before the podcast. But one of the things that I think the space is not ready for is we're kind of in this like weird limbo where there's a lot of jurisdictions contemplating regulation. There's a lot of jurisdictions putting out their first versions of regulation, but none of it has become completely and undeniably enforceable yet in most jurisdictions. The problem is going to be all of a sudden when regulation starts to proliferate, you're going to have different regulatory structures and environments in every single country that you have to try to navigate as potentially as a protocol. Now, you and I both believe that there's going to be infrastructure solutions that help reduce a lot of that friction. But here's an example of, again, kind of the evidence that leads into my criticism. So here's the South Africa. They've been talking about this big push to get licenses out in 2023, 2024. So essentially they took in 128 applications and they plan to discuss 36 of them as a group. So that means essentially 75% of them have immediately been removed from the application process. Now, my criticism with that is 36 is a really, really, really low number of protocols that have exposure to South African users. So what does that mean for all of the other protocols? Do they have to cease operations? How do you do that? How do you cease operations if people already hold your asset? You cannot claw them back. So what are you going to do? And I think this is going to be a real problem. And I think this is one thing that jurisdictions aren't talking enough about. We talk about Nigeria and Congo and Kenya and a lot of these African countries. I mean, Nigeria, as an example, has been working diligently on some crypto regulation. The problem is they've given out like 6 licenses. Don't quote me on that because I know it's an inaccurate number. But what on earth are we going to do when all of a sudden this comes in full force globally and all these jurisdictions do not have the infrastructure to deal with applications? We're going to end up with the same friction and problems that we all complain about in TradFi currently, that it costs $10 to $15 million and takes 2 years before you even start your business. And so hopefully we can figure that out. Do you think we're going to see infrastructure solutions and different things that are going to help with this, Patrick? I know we're biased, but how do you view the future when it comes to kind of global multinational regulation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it probably will be an infrastructure solution. I mean, look, it's not feasible for each of these jurisdictions to implement every enforcement action of every violation unless there's some type of automation, and that automation would be facilitated through kind of bespoke infrastructure. So I don't see any way around it. I mean, if you don't build bespoke infrastructure for this, then most cases will go unenforced, and maybe that's good. Like maybe that's what people want, or maybe that's better because the enforcement, especially initially, is going to be based on criteria that haven't been honed yet. So maybe it's better if most of the cases go kind of unenforced, but I don't see any way.
And then the most egregious ones are enforced according to the rules, possibly, right?
Yeah. Sorry, the biggest ones, is that what you said?
The most egregious, like the
Yeah. So there'll be a few really obvious ones, and then most of them will just go unenforced, right? These jurisdictions don't have the resources. I mean, there's going to have to be some type of automation or infrastructure component to this.
I just can't think of any other vertical in my lifetime, for sure, or even in the few decades prior to my lifetime that I have some information on. I can't think of any other space that has had to have global regulation at relatively similar times with completely different motivations and many influential vectors. So an example, taxation, politics, monetary policy. Like there's so many kind of angles influencing every country's regulatory moves. I can't think of any other industry to use as an analog. Like, yeah, there was some internet regulation. We've seen telecom regulation and communications and all this stuff. But that happened like kind of slowly over a long ass period of time with like major partners paving the way, so to speak. Crypto, I mean, we were allowed to evolve for so long that trying to put those monkeys back in the can is a bit of a challenge now. And we're kind of seeing it. So it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, I'm also with you in the sense that I think there's going to be infrastructure providers that are going to, because otherwise it's going to be impossible. I mean, if you're a protocol and you have to,
it's not going to be possible. Yeah,
you have to set regulation in 100 jurisdictions on day one because you already have 30,000 wallets holding your assets. What are you possibly going to do?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is though, what's interesting, and people don't really like to hear this, but there are quite a few different things that are made much more efficient by the Web3 tech. And one of them is enforcement. People don't like to hear this, but there are modifiers on smart contracts. There are precompiles if you're building your own subnet or your own layer one. You can implement artifacts at the level of the wallet. It's so easy at multiple different kind of layers of the Web3 ecosystem to implement permissions at extremely low cost.
Yeah.
I don't see how there isn't an infrastructure solution for this
and low friction.
Yeah.
That's the other problem, is like the friction of all of that is generally so high. The cost, the friction, the time, the uncertainty. I mean, yeah, there's going to have to be something that streamlines that. I don't know. Maybe we'll come up with a solution one day. We'll see. Anyways, that brings us to the end of our time together. We actually went over a little bit today. Patrick, thank you a ton for jumping on. We are going to do a few more deeper discussions, single topic discussions in the coming weeks and months. And Patrick has some ideas, and we're going to do a few of those with him. So stay tuned. Definitely keep an eye on our Twitters and his and everywhere else to see when those dates are coming up. We're a live show Monday to Friday, 12:30 p.m. Eastern. Like, share, subscribe, hit the bell, do all that shit. Help us get the word out. Any final thoughts?
No, man. Always a pleasure to be here.
Thanks, brother. With that, I say to you, my friend, go FUD yourself.